So the book is called Daughters of Hecate, Women and Magic in the Ancient World. And it was originally intended to be part two, like the sequel to my dissertation, which looked at women and representations of women in magic and stereotypes of women in magic. And then I conceived, well, the next logical step would be to look at actual evidence for women's magical practices. And in the end, I decided that there were so many people, smart, interesting people working in this field, that it would be pertinent to invite everybody to contribute to a collected volume. So the book covers broadly the ancient Mediterranean. So we cover Judaism, we cover Christianity, and we cover Greece and Rome. One of the things that was exciting for me, challenging and exciting, is that I believe that, like many people, I came with certain preconceptions about what I would find. That a lot of the texts, they undercut in a way this association between women and magic, and that we found that some places where you thought women would be associated with magic or magic identified with women, in fact, it wasn't the case. So it's important to remember when we're thinking about magic in the ancient world that magic was a normal, ordinary part of people's existence. We live in a world, say, that's populated by germs and by bacteria, right? And so we might carry disinfectant wash in our purses or something, or if we catch a cold, we'll go and take an antibiotic. People in the ancient world thought of themselves as living in a sort of a cosmos populated by demons. And if you were sick, it was because you were being attacked by a demon. If you meant to do harm to somebody, you might send a demon against them, right? And this was standard technology practice. Magic was also an accusation that was leveled against people, right? It was a discourse of alterity. It was a way to other somebody, to say that what they're doing is unacceptable or illegitimate. So on one hand, we have tons of spells, like we know people were doing this, and on the other hand, we have the literature that portrays it in a highly negative way. So we know that for the most part, society regarded magic negatively, thought it was something you shouldn't do, and on the other hand, people were doing it. So one way that I find helpful is to think of magic as a discourse, right? It's a way of talking about what's legitimate and illegitimate that may or may not have anything to do with what people are actually doing. And on the other hand, it is something that people are actually doing that they may themselves think of as legitimate or illegitimate. So it's possible to do something that you know to be socially unacceptable, but to do it deliberately. I think of punk rock or something. It's a way, it's like a social statement, a subversive discourse, right? You're trying to challenge the status quo. And for many people who may not have had access to power, they may have been slaves, they may have been marginalized, they may have been locked out of the normal means, right, to the courts, to financial support. They may have felt that their voices were marginalized and they were helpless. Those sorts of people may have been drawn to magic as a weapon of the weak. So the first section is called Fiction and Fantasy, Gendering Magic in the Ancient World. Primarily, we're interested in the stereotyping of women, the fantasies of women. So this is fictional literature for the most part, and looking at how men largely have constructed ideas about women's magic. What is interesting is that Annette Reed in particular really challenges this and says, so many scholars have argued for a particular reading of texts like Enoch and the association between magic, the fallen angels, and women. And so one of the things that Annette Reed's chapter in particular did was raise questions about what are the preconceptions that we as scholars bring to text, and then we ourselves are finding evidence to reinforce our own preconceptions. And so we may be gendering texts that weren't originally gendered. So part two looks at gender and magic discourse in practice. So this is the section of the book where we're looking at how this association between women and magic is actually functioning in other kinds of texts. So for example, Kirsty Copeland's looking at tours of hell. And unlike medieval tours of hell, such as Dante's Inferno, where sorcery is always associated with women, and it's women who are being punished for sorcery or magic, in the text she's looking at, the Apocalypse of Paul and the Apocalypse of Peter, you actually find magic and magicians gender neutral. So it's men and women who are being punished. Part 3 looks at women and magic in the material record. So this is personally my favorite part of the book. This is where we really get into the nitty-gritty. So we have these texts that associate women and magic, whether they're homilies, whether they're discussions of political intrigue and accusations against women. So we have Yaakov Elman in particular is doing some fascinating stuff on magic bowls and looking at the evidence both based from the Babylonian Talmud and the Aramaic incantation bowls from Mesopotamia and from Palestine. And he concludes that yes, there is evidence that women were exorcists and that they were probably makers of these bowls, but not exclusive makers, and that they may have been equal partners in the production of magic spells with men. The final paper in the book is by Anne-Marie Lewandike, and she's examining a particular papyrus, which is an amulet, a protective amulet for a woman in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, and seems to be a pious Christian. So Anne-Marie analyzes first the spell and tries to uncover what was the historical circumstances. It's for a fever, and so what kind of fevers? Malaria was very common, for example. What people might have been suffering from, who this woman might have been, what her age and social status might have been, and who probably produced this magic spell, and concludes that it was almost certainly produced by a member of the clergy. When thinking about magic as a discourse, I think it's important to think about who's using the label magic and how they're labeling things. So for example, for us moderns, an amulet would be considered magic because we don't believe that it's legitimate or that it's scientific or helpful. In certain periods of the ancient world, an amulet would have been considered absolutely, completely normal. Like you'd go to the doctor and you'd be given an amulet. And it's really important, for me at least, not all scholars ascribe to this, but I think it's really, really important because magic is a discourse, right? Because magic is a way of labeling things, is to understand how the people involved are labeling it. If they're not labeling it magic, then I think we as scholars need to be aware, or at least very self-conscious about our labeling of something magic.